August 23, 1305. Smithfield, London. The morning sun rises over a restless crowd gathered not for justice, but for spectacle. In the center stands a man, bound and bloodied, tied to a wooden hurdle dragged through the filthy streets of the English capital. His name, William Wallace. Once hailed as the fiercest defender of Scottish freedom, now condemned as a traitor to the English crown. But his sentence is no ordinary death. He will be hanged until nearly dead, then disemboweled alive, his intestines burned before his eyes. He will be castrated, then beheaded, and finally his body will be quartered, each limb sent to different corners of the kingdom, his head displayed on London Bridge like a trophy. This is the punishment reserved for England's worst traitors. But Wallace's crime wasn't betrayal, it was resistance. He had never sworn allegiance to King Edward I. In fact, he never accepted Edward's right to rule Scotland. So why was he being executed like a monster? What kind of man inspires this level of wrath from an empire? To answer that, we must return, not to the battlefield, but to the fog-shrouded hills of Scotland, where a young boy once listened to stories of kings and freedom. Because William Wallace didn't start as a warrior. He began as a second son, born into a peaceful kingdom, a kingdom that was shattered by the sudden death of its king and devoured by England's thirst for power. The road to Smithfield began not with rebellion, but with a crisis of succession, a child monarch who never reached the throne, and a ruthless English king named Longshanks, whose ambitions would plunge a nation into war. And out of that chaos, a legend was born. William Wallace was not born a rebel. Around the year 1270, in the quiet hamlet of Elderslie, he entered a world still untouched by the chaos that would soon engulf it. His father, Malcolm Wallace, was a minor landowner, a knight of no great fame, but of respectable service to the Scottish crown. His family's holdings were modest, their name not engraved in the annals of kings, but William would change that. At the time of his birth, Scotland was sovereign. Ruled by King Alexander III, the kingdom thrived in relative peace and prosperity. Trade flourished, borders held. The Scots respected their monarch, and Alexander's firm yet fair rule gave little cause for rebellion. For young William, those early years were marked not by war, but by a sense of order, security, and hope. But in 1286, everything shattered. King Alexander died suddenly after falling from his horse in the dark. His death left no living heir, save for his granddaughter Margaret, known as the Maid of Norway, who was only 3 years old. Her claim to the throne was more symbolic than practical, and before she could even set foot on Scottish soil, she died en route from Norway. What followed was not succession, it was succession crisis. With no clear ruler, Scotland fell into a dangerous vacuum. Competing nobles, chiefly John Balliol and Robert Bruce, staked their claims to the crown, fracturing unity just when it was needed most. Desperate for a solution, the Scottish lords made a fateful decision. They invited Edward I of England to arbitrate. It was like asking a wolf to guard the sheep. Edward, nicknamed Longshanks for his imposing height, was no neutral judge. He was a conqueror, a strategist, a king who believed in imperial destiny. In the Scottish throne, he saw not a kingdom to protect, but a jewel to seize. He selected John Balliol as king, but only after forcing him to swear fealty to the English crown. Scotland had not just lost its monarch, it had surrendered its sovereignty. Edward's rule was immediate and brutal. He demanded taxes, military support, absolute loyalty, and when the Scots resisted, he responded with fire and steel. In 1296, he invaded with a vengeance, sacking towns, executing leaders, and even stealing the Stone of Destiny, the sacred coronation stone, from Scone Abbey to display in Westminster Abbey, a symbolic theft meant to humiliate the entire nation. By the time Wallace came of age, Scotland was no longer free. It was a kingdom in chains, a land ruled by a foreign crown, its people crushed under English boots. But not every Scot bowed their head. Some say Wallace rose for Scotland. But what if it began with something simpler? Grief, pride, and one English official who pushed too far. Because before he was a general, before the battles, before the blood and banners, William Wallace was just a man raised in a land that forgot how to kneel. And the day he chose to fight back, Scotland would never be the same. By 1297, the kingdom was under brutal occupation. Edward I had reduced it to a puppet state. English sheriffs patrolled the streets, garrison soldiers looted villages, and the once proud nobles of Scotland either bent the knee or vanished into silence. But not everyone. In the town of Lanark, something happened. Something small, at first glance. An altercation between William Wallace and a local English official named William Heselrigg. The sheriff, known for cruelty and arrogance, reportedly tried to arrest Wallace over an insult to English authority. But Wallace didn't run. He fought back. According to some accounts, he killed Heselrigg in single combat. Others claim it was an ambush, swift and brutal. Either way, Heselrigg's blood was the spark, and Scotland exploded. Wallace didn't flee into the hills. He rallied. He struck the garrison at Lanark, massacring the English soldiers and reclaiming the town. Not in the name of a rival king, not for political gain, but for something far more dangerous. Freedom. Word spread. Fast. From village to village, castle to castle, the legend of a new kind of leader took shape. Not a noble with a claim to the throne, but a warrior who fought for the people themselves. Wallace's rebellion was unlike anything Scotland had seen. He didn't wait for alliances or royal permission. He recruited farmers, blacksmiths, millers, men with no banners, only rage. And with each English patrol ambushed, each outpost burned, the movement grew. By the summer of 1297, Wallace had built an army from the ashes. What began as a few dozen men had become thousands, moving like smoke through the highlands, hitting hard, vanishing fast, striking fear into the heart of the English occupation. They called him a bandit, a ghost, a savage with no pedigree. But Edward would soon realize this was not rebellion, it was revolution. And that terrified the English crown, because Wallace wasn't just fighting battles, he was fighting an idea that Scotland could rise without a king, without the nobility, without permission. This wasn't about restoring an old order, it was about burning the chains and building something new. Which is why, when the English gathered their greatest army to crush him, they thought it would be easy. But Wallace had one more lesson to teach them, at a place called Stirling Bridge. The English believed they were walking into a cleanup operation. In September of 1297, King Edward I sent a seasoned force under John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, and Hugh de Cressingham, the ruthless treasurer of Scotland. Their mission? To crush the rebellion led by a so-called outlaw, William Wallace, and restore English control once and for all. They brought with them over 20,000 troops, knights in gleaming armor, elite Welsh longbowmen, and seasoned foot soldiers. Wallace's army, by comparison, was smaller, less trained, poorly equipped, and underestimated. But Wallace didn't need brute strength. He had something far more dangerous: tactical brilliance. On September 11, 1297, the two armies faced each other across the River Forth at Stirling. Only one way crossed the river, a narrow wooden bridge. Surrey assumed Wallace would retreat. No one expected a direct confrontation. Wallace had a different plan. He allowed a portion of the English army to cross, just enough to make them feel confident, just enough to trap them. And when the moment came, he struck. Scottish troops surged from the hills in perfect timing. The bridge behind the English forces was too narrow for reinforcement. The cavalry couldn't maneuver. Panic spread. It wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The English were cut down by the hundreds, then the thousands. Cressingham, the most hated symbol of English rule, was killed and, according to legend, flayed. Wallace's men were said to have made sword belts from his skin. The rest of the English army, still on the southern bank, watched helplessly as their comrades drowned, burned, or were butchered in the mud. In one morning, the outlaw became a general, and the rebellion became a war. Stirling Bridge wasn't just a tactical victory, it was psychological warfare. A nation that had been beaten, betrayed, and broken finally saw hope, raw, defiant, and covered in English blood. News of the triumph raced across Europe. Wallace was no longer a nameless rebel. He was hailed as Guardian of Scotland, a title once reserved for royalty. Foreign kings began to treat him as a legitimate statesman. He had no blood claim to the throne, but he held the loyalty of a people. But victories come at a price. And while Wallace raised Scotland's banner higher than it had flown in decades, he also painted a target on his back. Edward Longshanks was humiliated, and Edward was not a king who forgave humiliation. His vengeance would come soon, and it would be biblical. For Edward I, the defeat at Stirling Bridge wasn't just a military embarrassment, it was a personal insult. The most powerful monarch in Western Europe had been outsmarted by a man with no title, no noble lineage, and no formal army. So he prepared his response the only way he knew how, with overwhelming force. In the summer of 1298, Edward personally led an army north, 30,000 men, the largest military force he had ever assembled. It included the full might of English heavy cavalry, siege weapons, and thousands of Welsh longbowmen, the most feared ranged force of the era. Wallace, now guardian of Scotland, knew what was coming. He couldn't rely on the same tricks he used at Stirling: open terrain, massed infantry, longbow fire. This would be a different war. At Falkirk on July 22nd, the two armies met. Wallace deployed his troops into schiltrons, tight circular formations of spearmen designed to repel cavalry, like giant, bristling hedgehogs. Between the circles, he placed what few archers he had, hoping to blunt the English charge. At first, it worked. The English cavalry surged forward and broke. Horses impaled themselves on Scottish spears. Riders fell in heaps. For a moment, it seemed that Wallace might repeat the impossible. But Edward hadn't shown his hand yet. He ordered the Welsh archers to advance. Thousands of arrows darkened the sky. The Scots, poorly armored and packed tightly, had nowhere to run. The very formations that had saved them became cages. Blood soaked the grass. Steel split bone. Wallace ordered a retreat, but the damage was done. Falkirk was a catastrophe. The guardian of Scotland was now a fugitive. Many nobles who once stood with Wallace bent the knee to Edward after Falkirk. To them, the rebellion was over. But Wallace disagreed. He vanished into the wilds of Scotland and began a new kind of war. He became a ghost. For the next 7 years, Wallace waged guerrilla warfare, small bands, swift raids, brutal ambushes. He struck at supply lines, freed captured Scots, assassinated English officials. Every fire he lit kept the dream of freedom alive. But Edward had learned his lesson. He understood now that Wallace wasn't just a man, he was a myth in the making. And myths, unlike armies, are harder to kill. He had lost the battlefield. But in losing, Wallace became something far more dangerous than a victor, a symbol. That's why Edward offered massive rewards for Wallace's capture. That's why spies were sent across Europe to track him. Because as long as Wallace breathed, Scotland would not kneel. And in 1305, one man finally did what English armies could not. He betrayed him. In 1305, after nearly a decade of evading death, William Wallace's luck ran out. Not on the battlefield, but in the shadows. He was betrayed. The man responsible was Sir John Menteith, a fellow Scot, a nobleman who had sworn allegiance to the English crown in exchange for lands, titles, and favor. Menteith handed Wallace over near Glasgow in the dead of night. No battle, no glory, just cold chains and a quiet betrayal that would stain his name forever. Wallace was transported to London, bound like a criminal, paraded through jeering crowds who knew him only as the enemy of their king. But he did not enter the city like a man defeated. Witnesses wrote that he carried himself like a soldier, not a prisoner, his back unbroken, his gaze unflinching. He stood trial at Westminster Hall, the grand courtroom of English power, where kings had been crowned and traitors condemned. The charges? Treason, sacrilege, and murder. But Wallace's response cut through the courtroom like steel. "I have never sworn allegiance to Edward. I cannot be a traitor to a king I do not recognize." He was sentenced immediately. The punishment, hanged, drawn, and quartered. The most brutal sentence available under English law. A message, not just a death. On August 23, 1305, Wallace was tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged through the streets of London, from the Tower to Smithfield. The crowd jeered. Stones were thrown. But the man who had once defied an empire made no sound. At the scaffold, he was partially hanged, suspended until he lost consciousness, then cut down, still breathing. He was stripped. His abdomen was sliced open. His intestines were pulled out and burned before his eyes. Then he was castrated, still alive, still watching. Only then was his head removed. His body was quartered, cut into 4 pieces, and sent to different cities as a warning. This is what happens to those who dare defy the crown. His head was placed on a spike above London Bridge. His limbs sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Perth, and Stirling, cities that had once chanted his name. They tried to destroy the man, but in the agony they orchestrated, they created a martyr. Because Wallace's death did not silence Scotland, it ignited it. Within a year, Robert the Bruce, the grandson of a former throne claimant, rose in open defiance. The War of Independence began anew. Edward Longshanks, obsessed with ending the rebellion, would die in campaign, taking his hatred for Wallace to the grave. And Wallace? He became more than a man. He became a memory sharpened into a sword, a name that still echoes through the halls of every people who've ever longed for freedom. William Wallace died in agony, his body torn apart to send a message, one of terror, of dominance, of what awaits those who rise against an empire. But the message failed. Instead of extinguishing the dream of a free Scotland, the English crown ignited something far more dangerous, a legend. Wallace's brutal death did not demoralize his people. It immortalized him. He became not just a martyr, but a mirror, reflecting every injustice, every act of tyranny, and every whisper of resistance across generations. Less than a year after his execution, Robert the Bruce took up the cause, murdering his rival John Comyn in a church and seizing the Scottish crown. The War of Independence surged back to life, this time with clearer purpose and deeper fury, fueled by the ghost of Wallace, who had shown what it meant to fight without compromise. Edward I, the man who sought to break Wallace publicly, died in 1307. On campaign, still trying to crush the rebellion that Wallace refused to let die. His death marked the beginning of the end for English hopes of dominating Scotland. But Wallace's legacy didn't stop at borders. Over the centuries, his name has come to stand for something more than just national pride. It has become shorthand for unflinching defiance, for courage in the face of absolute power, for choosing honor over survival. He was no king, no nobleman of grand estate, yet his story has outlived most who wore crowns. Today, over 700 years later, the name William Wallace is carved into the soul of a nation and into the conscience of every people who ever dared to believe that freedom was worth the cost of everything. So now we ask, was he a hero, a revolutionary, or simply a man who refused to bow? And more importantly, what would we choose standing at the scaffold? Would we kneel or rise? The next story begins with your voice. Whose truth do you want unearthed next?